Hello and welcome to the Language Revolution podcast. My name is Cate Hamilton. I'm a languages teacher and founder of Babel Babies. The aim of this podcast is to get people talking about talking. So without further ado, let's get started. Language is rather a Mount Everest of subjects. I'd like to find out how we can help our youngsters fall in love with language again and why we should study it as a subject. And if there's one person who can help get to the top of this Mount Everest, it's Professor David Crystal. Good afternoon, David.
Hello, Cate. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for joining me today on the podcast. David, babies and children love playing with language, and somehow I feel that we lose this playfulness in our formal education. Why do humans like playing with language so much?
I think it's one of the big driving forces behind language. There are three big forces that drive language. One is the need to understand each other. The second is to express our identity. And the third is to play. And that playfulness comes right at the very beginning. As soon as you're out of the womb and listening to everybody talking to you, you're hearing people talking to you in some very strange ways. All the baby talk, oh, you lovely little baby, you are gorgeous, yes, you are, and all this sort of thing.
Yes.
Now, everybody does this,
Yes.
Some more than others. And so suddenly the baby is encountering a world in which people change their voices, say silly things, and if there's an instinct for play, it's immediately reinforced by that kind of encounter.
And in the playfulness, I suppose they elicit care and responses from their parents. So it's a positively reinforced playfulness.
Yes, play is a mutually reinforcing thing. You can play by yourself, of course, but in linguistics we have this notion of accommodation. One accommodates to the behaviour of the person one is talking to or being with, and play is very much an example of that. You see it very, very clearly when people make tape recordings of kids playing at age 2 or 3 years of age, and they're just playing away with dolls or planes or whatever it is, and one kid starts to play with words. I remember making a recording once where one kid started off by saying, I got an airplane, he's got a wing, he's got a wing, he's got a wingo, a wingo, a wingo. And the other kid says, a wingabo, a wingabo, a wingabo. And they suddenly start trading off each other like this and teaching each other different kinds of play. Now, this all comes very naturally. No parent has ever taught them to do this.
No, that's almost like rap poetry or stand-up poetry.
I think
it's beautiful, isn't it?
I think the analogy is very clear. They love to play with the sounds of words. And because nobody's taught them to do it, one has to assume that there's something innate here and that there is a kind of instinct towards language play, which may go back to the very beginning of language, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Who knows? But the point is, all kids do it, and I've never come across a language where it doesn't happen.
Right. So there's a lot of discussion in the language teaching community about the downfall or the downturn in take-up of languages, and we seem to be losing that connection with playfulness. It's become a really serious and dry and perhaps not so inspiring subject. I wonder if we could explore how we might regain this childlike wonder with words. Can linguistics help us perhaps get into regaining some of the playfulness that we have?
To go back to the point you were just making before, what went wrong. And if one can diagnose what went wrong, then maybe one can see ways about making it right. And the best example of what went wrong, I think, was in the area of learning to read. So you get all these kids who are enjoying language so much and bouncing off each other with language and making noises and things of this kind. And then they go to school and they pick up, one of the old readers. Where, hello, we are now learning to read. My name is Janet and your name is John. And we are going to visit our grandmother in the countryside. All of this. Very staid, very full kinds of grammar. No fun at all. And this puts a lot of kids off. I mean, they learn to read, of course, as you do, but it's not fun anymore. And then a little later, last 20, 30 years, I suppose, we get a new kind of reading material out there. You get a story about a spaceship landing.
Yes.
And in the old days, it would have been, the spaceship has landed. And now you get this lovely picture and kerplash. is written all the way across the page.
Yes.
And, you know, anybody who reads this wants to say it aloud immediately. And so you get the fun element coming into a lot of the new reading materials. Now, exactly the same thing happens at the oral level as well. When I was growing up in school, you don't talk in class. Good Lord, no. You get penalised for talking in class. You can get punished for talking in class. Speech, oracy, generally, is not considered to be a very good thing. But now, once again, in many classrooms I'll go into to observe, I sense a complete sea change in this respect. If a kid wants to speak, as long as he's not too disruptive, of course, then speaking is valued.
Yes.
And the opportunity to say things and to act out things. We were talking about plays and things later, and Shakespeare and so on, but the opportunity to be
find
present to the class with your own voice and to respond to other people's voices is now highly valued, it seems to me.
Yes, I was reading in a formative assessment document a child who said, when I say it, then I know it. And I think we need to have that opportunity, don't we, to actually sort of articulate our thoughts out loud.
Yes, that's right. And the feeling of what it is like to say something. See, this is another thing. Kids are taught to write little stories very, very early on. But when I'm writing my books and things, one of the things I do before I send the manuscript off to the publisher is I read it aloud.
Yes.
If it doesn't sound right, then there's something wrong with the writing.
Right.
Now, you know, I know some teachers who do this with stories. All right, you've written your little homework essay and so on. Let's read it aloud together and see how it sounds.
Yes.
Not enough of that is done, it seems to me.
Yes, so speaking aloud can help us to sort of feel the words, can't it? And help us with word choices and, you know, create...
That's right.
Create more passion, I think. You know, we need to get that passion for words and speaking back.
Yeah, and notice that how you research this. You research it by first and foremost observing, describing, recording, analysing the language that is used, the language that is not used. And this is, to go back to your other question, this is where linguistics comes into play. I mean, all linguistics is the study of language, the science of language, but that's all one is doing. One is studying language and languages, of course. All the languages in the world are waving at us and saying, come and study me, come and study me.
Yeah.
And now, for most practical purposes at the moment, primary school teachers are interested in the English language, and we're trying to extend that remit, of course. But what you have to do is find out, first of all, what children actually do. And there's a branch of linguistics called child language acquisition, which spends all its time doing precisely that.
Yes.
And then you've got to, of course, have the skills to be able to describe what's going on. You have to be able to write down the speech, which means you have to have a bit of phonetics under your belt.
Yeah.
And then once you've written it down, you have to be able to analyse it and say, oh, look at the words that are being used and look at the grammar that's being used. And then that scary word grammar comes along. Well, it isn't as scary as all that once you know how to do it well. Yes. And so linguistics comes into play when you are giving teachers or parents or anybody the tools they need in order to foster the intentions that they would like to see manifest in the kids.
Yes, indeed. So linguistics can feel a little bit, perhaps, of a mountain for people. So if we were going to try and introduce linguistics in to the children, you know, in their education, maybe primary and secondary, is there a nice in point, like if we said, oh, we'll look at etymology because that's can be quite fun, or you know, would you have any suggestions?
I wouldn't use the word linguistics for a start.
No.
Which is really quite a heavy word to introduce to anybody, and also it has had a certain amount of a bad press in the sense that because it can be such an abstract subject and studied in such an abstract way. Remember, linguistics is a study of all languages.
Yes.
And that means if you're trying to devise rules which will explain the structure of all of human language, then it can get rather abstract.
Yes.
Now, so you don't want to start there. Now, where you want to start is with the topics in language that will interest the clientele that you're wanting to get interested in language. So you don't start by talking to them about subjects that are of really no direct interest or whatever it might be.
No.
So you do a little kind of case study. What are you interested in, kids? What drives you? And depending on the age range, the answer might be cartoons on telly, or it might be a video game, or it might be pop music, or it might be we've just had a little baby brother or sister, and we were wondering what name to give it, and what does the name mean?
Yes.
Or it might be we live in a certain place. That's a funny name for that place. What does that name mean? And so on.
There's lots of inroads.
Lots of inroads, so long as you start with the interests of the constituency that you're dealing with.
Yes, you've got the students at the centre of that. So could you give us a little bit of an overview then? So if we're talking about the different domains of linguistics, we've touched on child language acquisition, phonetics, I mentioned etymology.
Well, there are two sides to language study. One is the study of the structure of language. The other is the study of the uses that language has. Now, when you go into the structure of language, then you study the first and foremost the meaning, because that's what language is all about, the meanings that language can express. And the technical term for the study of that is semantics.
Yes.
So that's at the heart of language. And then you ask, well, how are these meanings expressed? And the most important way of expressing a meaning is to put it into sentences, and the study of sentences is called grammar.
Yes.
So that's the second big domain. And then you ask, well, how are we going to express those words and meanings and grammatical and sentences? And you say, well, I could do it through speech, in which case you're now into the study of the sound system of a language, how it works. It's called phonology, and the actual manifestation of that phonology in everyday speech, which you study through the medium of phonetics. Then on the written language, you can write down your meaning and your grammar, and that leads you into the subject of graphology, which is the study of the writing system of a language.
Yes.
And then you can actually take that further and look at the way in which graphology manifests itself in handwriting or in print, and that's graphetics, like phonetics, you see.
I see.
Now, all of this is part of the structure of language. Then, having done that, you ask yourself, well, how can language be used? And it can be used in four main ways. One is it's used in the sense of time. Language changes over time. This is the historical study of language, going right back to Anglo-Saxon times, historical linguistics, or used to be called philology once upon a time. And the other dimension of time is when children change language acquisition, learning from knowing nothing to knowing everything, and then through old age, where you might get a deterioration of language. So there's the time dimension to language use. Secondly, there's the regional dimension to language use. Language varies and changes depending on where it is being used.
Indeed.
So now we're talking about accents and dialects and things of that kind. And the third dimension is the social variation. In other words, depending on who you are in society, so you will speak differently or write differently.
Yes.
If you're upper class or lower class, or if you have a certain occupation or any of these things, then all of this will lead to a set of variations which can be studied under the heading of sociolinguistics.
Yes.
And then fourthly, and perhaps in a sense most important of all, there is individual variation, the way in which we as individual beings change our language, vary our language. So I might be able to I speak to you in a different way from anybody else in the world. My voice is unique, my style is unique. If we go to literature, of course, Shakespeare is unique, Wordsworth is unique. There's the study of language problems in individual children or adults, the sort of thing that speach and language therapists study. So you're studying individual variations. So they're the four kinds: time, region, society, and individuality. So and that, in a nutshell, is what linguistics is all about.
So it is such a variety of different aspects of it. So is there one in particular that might encourage children to dive into language? I was wondering, because we first met at the launch of LASER, which is a linguistics initiative for taking children to the Linguistics Olympiad and doing puzzles. And
older children there, though.
They're slightly older children. So that kind of decoding, could perhaps that help get boys, for example. So boys are in the minority of the GCSE languages cohort. There's only 30% of boys who take languages. Could perhaps we incorporate somehow some linguistic puzzles and get people looking at language in a very different way to the way we sort of...
Oh, sure. But the things like the Olympiad have so far been aimed at the kind of puzzles that they present are really quite sophisticated.
So that's very sophisticated.
And they're brilliant at it, of course.
Could we bring it down some aspects of that, do you think, maybe for younger puzzling minds?
It's back to the question of what kind of thing will interest the level that you're dealing with. So if we're talking about 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds, then you need to devise puzzles which are appropriate to the not just the cognitive level that they're at, but also the interest level that they're at.
So I find that children are really interested in spotting patterns.
Yeah.
And so when we teach different languages at Babel Babies, we'll say, oh, this song we're saying bati piedi in Italian, and they say, oh, that's like pied in Spanish, and then they are very adept. They're very adroit at spotting when things match, and they like to follow
they are indeed, and they get a lot of training in that earlier on in language acquisition. This is the pedagogical value of things like nursery rhymes, for instance, because what rhyme does is it draws your attention to the fact that 2 words can have a similar sound, and this is fun, and then you can break the rhyme, and that's fun as well, because language is, to a very large extent, the fun side of language is you learn the rules and then you break them. And it's the breaking of rules, it's the fun bit, but you have to learn the rules first.
That's right.
And this is all done very naturally in early language acquisition, of course.
Because we talk about grammar as if it's a bit of a difficult, terrible, bête noire subject that we don't want to get too involved with. But actually, children, they just get on with grammar when they're very little, don't they? And they almost seem to, from my experience as a parent, I see them working grammar out. Like they say, oh, I went to the park, and they spot the patterns, and then... So actually, could we make grammar a lot less scary if we realise that all humans will, naturally acquire it? Yeah,
the scariness is when people find they have to learn the terminology in order to analyse grammar. They think that grammar is all about nouns and verbs and subjects and objects and things like that. And what is a preposition anyway? And this is an adverbial. What on earth is an adverbial? And so on. Now, that kind of analysis is useful, but it's not essential to the study of grammar. You can study grammar without using any of those terms, really, to begin with. And then as you get into grammar, then those terms turn out to be useful. Once again, you use the terms. You don't learn the terms in advance. You learn the terms as you need them in order to explain an interesting problem that comes up.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. It'll take a couple of minutes, but it's a good example. I was at a literary festival, and after my talk, I went out into the cafe, and there was a teacher with 3 or 4 kids, and she beckoned me over and said, "We'd like to talk to my kids." So I said, "Sure." And they were all looking at me. So I said, "What do you want to talk about?" And they didn't know what to say. And the teacher said, "Talk to them about grammar." And I said, "Oh, gosh, really, I can't do that. I can't do that without knowing what they want to do." So I said to one of them, a girl called Poppy, "Poppy, what do you want to do more than anything else?" Because she had a book in her hand. And she said, opening the book, it was Terry Pratchett's The Carpet People. And she said, "I want to write like Terry Pratchett when I grow up."
Very good.
So I said, "Okay, shall we work out how to do that?" "Oh, yes, please," she says. So we opened up the book, and it didn't take long to find an example like this one. "The room was full of 10,000 eyes, green, yellow, and white." I may be misquoting, but that's roughly it. And I said to her, "Do you like that sentence?" She says, "Yeah." "What's she like about it?" "Oh, it's creepy." She says, "It's creepy." "Yeah, do you know why it's creepy?" Silence. "Look, if Terry had written it this way, what do you think? The room was full of 10,000 green, yellow and white eyes." Which is the creepier sentence, Poppy? "The room was full of 10,000 green, red and yellow and white eyes," or "The room was full of 10,000 eyes, green, yellow and white." "Oh, the second one," she says. "Yes, that's right. But you know why it's creepy?" "No." "Well, look, if you put these words like green and yellow and white, do you know what they're called?" "No," she said. I think you do, said the teacher. They're adjectives. Oh, yes, said Poppy, they're adjectives. She knew about adjectives. She'd been drawing circles around them for ages.
Yes.
And she said, oh, yeah, they're adjectives. They're adjectives. Look, I said, if you put the adjectives in front of the noun, do you know about nouns? Oh, yes, she knew about nouns too. Put them in front of the noun and then put them behind the noun. It's creepier, isn't it, if you go behind the noun? So here's a little rule for you, Poppy. Put the adjectives after the noun, it's creepier. Put the adjectives before the noun, it's not creepy. Oh, can I try that out, says Poppy.
And then she's away.
And then she starts to write a little story in which every adjective goes after the noun. That's going too far. So we had to moderate it a little bit. But notice, within a couple of minutes, we were talking about adjective and noun as if it was a native language, you know.
Because there was a passion. She wanted to know that, didn't she?
And it was driven by a phenomenon of language in the first place.
Yes.
In other words,
Yes.
the intellectual analysis using terms like adjective and noun came after,
Indeed.
not came before.
Yes. I think we're starting to see worrying trend now in marking of children's writing, saying things like, this is lovely, but could you use some more fronted adverbials?
Oh, yeah.
Could you
But again, if you start off by realising what a fronted adverbial does, then you suddenly realise, I need a word to talk about this.
Yes.
What is it, teacher?
I don't think writers sit and think, how many fronted adverbials am I going to have in this paragraph? But they do know in their repertoire of craft.
No, but whenever I've talked to in a workshop about this, the important point about a fronted adverbial is that it's not a non-fronted adverbial. So the first thing you have to do is to say, here's a sentence. John went to town. Here's an adverb, quickly. Where can you put it in this sentence? You can say, John went to town quickly. John went quickly to town. John quickly went to town. Quickly, John went to town. Now, let's say these in a nice dramatic way. And which is the most dramatic way of saying it? And it's always, quickly, John went to town. In other words, put your adverb at the front and you get a frisson, which isn't there if you just say, John went to town quickly. Boring, you know.
And is that the standard word order then, to have it?
Yes,
linked?
and I mean, the kids know the standard word order. They've already learnt the language, as you were saying before. The teachers know this as well. But if you start by saying, right class, today we're going to talk about fronted adverbials. I mean, that will not work.
And studying those sort of grammatical terms in isolation doesn't translate into their writing improving, does it? Unless they have a sense of how it's a tool, and in their writing toolkit they might.
Yes, you've got to start. You've got to begin at the beginning. Now remember, there are 4 mediums in language. There's writing, reading, speaking and listening. And as many government reports have mentioned over the years, you've got to have all 4, the interrelationship between all 4. If you want to improve a kid's writing, you don't start with the writing. You start with the listening.
Right.
And then go on to the speaking, and then go on to the reading, and then go on to the writing. So, for instance, you notice that a kid has written an essay, and it's full of ands all over the place. Typical kid's essay. Write a story about your weekend. And the kid writes, I went to the beach and I bought an ice cream and I liked my ice cream and I came home and I went to bed. And you get and. Teacher correction. Don't use so many ands. Okay, right. It isn't good style. But what do you put in their place?
Yes.
Now, you can't, if you think that to put in your place, I'm going to give you a more difficult way, a more interesting way of linking those sentences, and you write it on the homework. Well, let's go back to the beginning. Is the kid, first of all, used to listening to more interesting ways? Linguistic task 1. What are the more interesting ways?
Yes.
How would you and I, as adults, link sentences together? Well, you and I do things like, John went to town. Fortunately, he got something. Oh, unfortunately, sadly, but later, a few hours later. These are the ways you and I link and would write more interesting stories. So, first question, is the kid used to listening to these things? Secondly, is the kid used to saying them aloud?
And that mirrors the language acquisition process, doesn't it, from birth?
Oh, it does.
They have to listen for a good couple of years before we start expecting them to speak.
And then reading, you're not going to be able to write these things unless you've read them. Has the kid had the opportunity to read books in which these more interesting connecting words are actually being used? I've got a lovely book here by an author called Remy Charlip called Fortunately. And every page as you turn over, begins with either fortunately something happened, turn over the page, unfortunately something happened, turn over the page, fortunately something happened. Now, kids love this kind of storytelling, and what it's doing is it's training sentence connecting adverbials. Well, there's the terminology, you see, but it comes in at the end of the realization that you need to develop that kind of skill. And then once you've gone through the listening, speaking and reading, then the writing should fall, it should just be automatic at that point, and kids will want to use words like fortunately and unfortunately. The job of the teacher then is to stop them doing it too much.
I believe that they do have a creative drive. They want to write well. You know, it's fun. It's very satisfying as well, isn't it?
All kids do, and it starts with listening and speaking. It starts with listening to stories when you're little, from your parents or from whoever, and kids who have not had that experience will be disadvantaged to some extent. But then later, listening to whoever might be around, whether it's on the internet or in a video game or whatever it might be. But then, crucially, as with foreign language learning as well, it's not just listening, you've got to be able to interact with whoever's doing the speaking. So speaking the story that you've just heard, I've got a lovely recording somewhere of my daughter Susie, actually, who at one point, not by me, is asked by somebody talking about pigs, and she says, I know a story about pigs, and the other person says, well, tell me.
Yes.
So she tells the story of the three little pigs in her own individual way, based on the fairy story, but changing it in all sorts of ways. And that is an instinct for eloquence that I think is a natural feature of all children who haven't got any kind of disability.
Yeah. And I noticed that mine, they like the Three Little Pigs story, but they'll like different aspects of it. So one of my children loves the wolf, and so we have to have a lot more wolf in the version.
Have you seen the story of the Three Little Pigs told from the point of view of the wolf?
I think I have.
Al G. Wolf. I mean, you know, everybody's got me wrong. All I wanted to do was go next door. My poor granny was ill, and I needed to get a cup of sugar to make her a cup of tea. So I knock on the door, and here's this pig comes to the door, you know, and he built his house of straw. What a stupid pig, you know. So have you got some sugar? And he's a bit scared of me. So he says, no. So, and then I felt a cold coming on, and I couldn't. I was going to sneeze, and I couldn't stop myself sneezing, and I sneezed a big sneeze, and huffed and puffed, and the straw house fell to pieces, and the poor little pig was lying there, and oh gosh, well, I mean, think of it like a hamburger. You know, and it goes on like this.
Brilliant.
And the kids love this kind of change.
They do, because they see that it's not a fixed narrative, can be played with, and I think
we're back on learn the rules and then break the rules.
That's it.
Kids love to break the rules, so long as it's within the parameters of, you know, decency and so on.
Yeah. So that's an interesting maybe link then to my next question, which is about how we're entering a bit of a new era of language, because we do a lot more writing on social media. We tend to communicate a lot more textually, perhaps, than we have done, because we're sending text messages and Facebook posts, and we're consuming a lot of media that's written down. And does that present some new and exciting possibilities that...
Oh, it most certainly does. But you have to remember that we're dealing with a very fast-moving world here. At the moment, the internet is predominantly graphic, about 80% to 20% audio. That will change. You know, the people in the industry say that within the next decade, it's going to become more 50-50 with audio versus graphic. And even within the narrow time frame since the internet began, we've seen massive changes in the graphic styles that people use and that are available for people to use. I mean, the classic case is text messaging, which came in the early 2000s, and became very popular amongst young kids because they could break the rules. They could abbreviate, do all sorts of funny abbreviations and things.
So some people
like
criticise that, but it's actually
at the time they did.
It's actually a skill, isn't it? If you have to know how to spell something.
Yeah, well, exactly.
So that then you can.
Yes, the people who criticised it did so before any of the research had been done to show that actually the people who are the best texters are actually the best spellers.
Yes.
And if you're not good at spelling, you're actually not very good at texting either.
Indeed.
If we go back to when texting was introduced, a lot of abbreviations were introduced at the time, and people felt that this was a really cool, new, fashionable way of communicating. And so they did have a huge fashionable impact amongst youngsters in particular. And that fashion peaked about in this country, different countries did it at different times, around about 2009, something like that. And since then, abbreviations have begun to fall away. And I was in a school not so long ago, talking to 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. One of the things I do is I often ask them to get a collection of text messages together, and we analyse the text messages. There wasn't a single abbreviation to be seen. I said, where have your abbreviations gone? And they said, they're not cool. They're not cool anymore. They used to be cool when we were young, said these 16-year-olds. But they're not cool now. And one guy said to me, I'll tell you when I stopped abbreviating. He said, I stopped when my dad started.
Yes.
And so there is this phenomenon as well. When old people steal young people's slang, it's no longer cool to use it. And then technological developments come along with predictive texting and things like that. And as soon as that happens, the motivation to abbreviate is simply not there anymore. So suddenly you get a phenomenon, a brand new phenomenon, which is hotly criticised when it arrives for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
It comes, it peaks, and it starts to go as its novelty wears off, to be replaced by something else. Emojis at the moment are in a similar peaking and will soon fall away. Now, technology is like that. The technology changes, the language associated with the technology changes. It's very difficult to predict the future with language, but the bottom line is that the kids of today are reading and writing far more than I was doing when I was their age, simply because the technology allows them to do it.
Does it, if we're communicating more through text then, does it...
And not just text, you see, but all the other social media platforms as well. Blogging, for instance, people say about texting and instant messaging and so on, oh, the sentences are very short. Well, of course they are, if you've got a character limitation like that. Though even so, with text messaging, 160 characters, that's 30 or so words. You can write some long sentences there. But think about blogging, for instance, and all of those sorts of things where you can have long essays written and it isn't just a short messaging service that we've got.
It might actually encourage people to be more into writing then. So will that perhaps show a bit of a renaissance for
it does, and the job of the teacher here is not to be scared of it and not to know very much about it or to dismiss it, but to come to terms with it, to get to grips with it, to master it, and then show the kids how you get from a text messaging style or a blogging style or a social app style to a more sophisticated writing style, which you can do through the medium of blogs and other systems like that, and show that there is a bridge to be made. I was in a class not so long ago and I saw a teacher doing excellent work like this. So here's the story you have to tell. Task 1, tell it as if it's a text message.
Yes.
Secondly, tell it as if you're writing it home to your gran. Thirdly, tell it as if, and so you're translating the same message into different mediums and using appropriate style. Tell it as if you're using it as, for the older kids, evidence that you're going to apply for a job, and so on. This is all about your background, you see. And so little simple things like you don't put a smiley at the end if you're applying for a job, you know.
No, indeed. So it does actually teach them about the registers and what's appropriate.
We're talking about appropriateness, and this is the crucial thing. If linguistics has done one thing, it has replaced the notion of an absolute correctness in language by a relative notion of appropriateness.
Yes.
This doesn't get rid of standards or anything like that. On the contrary, it fosters standards because you then tune your standard to the circumstances in which you find yourself. I use the analogy here of a wardrobe,
right?
As you know. So you go to your wardrobe.
That's in a little book of language, isn't it?
I use it a lot. Yes. You go to a wardrobe, open it up, and if you've got all sorts of different kinds of clothes, then you're ready to choose the right kind of clothes for the social event that you're going to go to the next day. If you've only got one kind of clothing in there, then you're pretty hamstrung, aren't you? You're not going to be ready to meet the needs of society. It's the same with language. In our heads, we should have a wardrobe full of lots of different styles, and you can choose the right style for the right circumstances. If you've only got one style, then it's hopeless. You're not going to meet the demands of society. And the job of teaching in this respect is to show how you evolve, if you haven't already instinctively got it, that variety of linguistic clothing that's in your brain wardrobe. And it starts at the very beginning. It doesn't start sort of at age 11 or anything. It starts at age 4, 5, or even younger. I've seen primary school teachers do brilliantly with things like, here's a cartoon character. What noise do you think that cartoon character would make?
Right.
And you've got a sort of, elephanty kind of shape, and the kids will all goes moo or something, and then you have a character with sort of jagged hair and things. What sort of noise do you think he would make? The kids all go, oh, yakka, 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 yakka. In other words, developing a notion that there are appropriate sounds for different types of context.
Yes.
Develop that into appropriate words, and then into appropriate sentences, and suddenly you're into traditional language study.
Yes, exactly. So we could build that through the whole curriculum and
dead right.
We shouldn't be afraid of technology. We should be showing the opportunities.
And that last thing you made is central to it. Build it through the whole curriculum.
Yeah.
When the national curriculum came in, I was really quite excited because I thought this is going to happen now, because the problem with the old style language teaching in schools was that you were dropped into everything at once, usually at around about age 11 or so. So the entirety of the language you had to pick up on, everything to do with grammar, everything to do in poetry, for example, with metre and things like this.
Yes.
Whereas the national curriculum began the notion of, let's grade these different things about language from the simpler to the more advanced. But unfortunately, the government did not put enough effort into teaching the teachers how to do this at the time, and the materials weren't there, and it's only recently they've tried to rush and catch up.
Yes.
And once again, most teachers tell me, they've told me I have to teach grammar. Where do I start?
Yeah.
And they give them a grammar book. Well, that is jumping in at the deep end.
Yes.
No. The best way to study grammar is to follow it through the process of language acquisition.
Right.
How do 1-year-olds do it? 1.5-year-olds do it? And when I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Making Sense, I called it the glamorous story of English grammar. People say, glamorous? Yeah, well, it is if you're studying it from the point of view of language acquisition and looking at how these lovely little kiddies sort of learn their grammar bit by bit, and you can learn about grammar by following the way they do it bit by bit.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I would definitely advocate that approach. I think if we look at how we, as humans, we learn language, the way we do it in school doesn't seem to follow the same pattern.
But it's a change of mindset, you see. You've really got to think yourself out of the box, because the tradition is, grammar. It's all about subjects and objects and nouns and verbs, and I must learn it all. And here is a grammar book. I will begin at the beginning and I will work up. Lord,
as if it's separate to what we actually say, though, do you?
Well,
Whereas actually grammar is just all tied up in how we learn to speak.
That's right. I mean, if you say to anybody, what's the important thing about language? They will say, eventually, elicit it if they don't say it spontaneously. It's all about meaning.
Right.
So you then say, well, how is meaning expressed? And they will say, well, through words. Well, are you sure about that? Let me give you a word. And if I give them a word and say, you tell me what it means. And I say, table. And they say, ooh, table. I don't know. I mean, it could mean anything. It could be a piece of furniture. It could be something on a page in a book.
Yes.
Give me some context, they say.
Right.
Or they might say, put it in a sentence and then we will know what you mean. So I put it in a sentence and say, the leg of the table is broken. Or I say, there's a mistake in the second row of the table. And they, now I know what you mean, of course. Put it in a sentence and then we'll know what you mean. That is what sentences are for.
Yes.
Sentences exist to make sense of words. Words by themselves do not make sense. Only sentences make sense, and grammar is the study of sentences.
Right.
So taking grammar as if it was separate from meaning is bizarre.
Yes.
Because grammar has no purpose without reference to meaning.
No, and studying the subject, object, sort of naming of parts type of grammar, without the context or the sentence,
it's pointless.
how are the children supposed to match up those terminology and those skills with?
I use an analogy here which always makes the point. People find it makes the point. I say, if you want to learn to drive, And you go to the driving instructor and he says, right, now sit there. Now, that's the steering wheel. That is the brake. That's the accelerator. Can I just check you've got that? What is that? Steering wheel. What is that? Brake. What is that? Accelerator. And he goes around and teaches me all the names of the parts of the car.
Yes.
And then says, fine, now you know how to drive.
Yes, well, that's a great analogy.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's the same with grammar. If you think you can do grammar just by knowing all the names of things, you've missed the point. You want to know all the other things to do with driving your grammar, like where exciting places to go to and the things you can do with it. Why do you want a car in the first place? Well, you know, and it's the same with grammar. Putting it in context is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It's been very fascinating to talk to you. Hopefully we can start to change the mindset and get language back in the centre of the curriculum.
If your podcasts don't do it, I don't think anything will.
Thank you, David.